It was supposed to be just another ordinary day for Maya Thompson. She woke up early, as she always did, before the sun had risen. She moved quietly through her home, careful not to disturb her husband, Jonathan, who was already asleep in their bedroom. It wasn't that she wanted to sneak around, it was just her routine. Maya had always been a woman who thrived on consistency. Her life had always been busy, yet controlled. She'd married Jonathan years ago, a man who had always been successful, yet humble. His work was mostly behind the scenes. He wasn't a man who flaunted wealth or power. Instead, he let his actions speak for him. The business world knew him as a savvy, low-profile investor. Maya liked it that way. She wasn't the type of person who enjoyed being in the spotlight. She preferred to be known for her own accomplishments rather than for who she was married to. Her friends, family, and even her colleagues knew very little about Jonathan's work. They only knew him as a quiet man who had built a quiet empire. That morning, Maya had a flight to catch. It was a business trip, a quick one to meet with a few clients in a neighboring city. She didn't expect anything to go wrong. She'd made this same trip countless times. Maya had always been the kind of person who kept her head down and her work in focus. She wasn't one to cause trouble. So, she slipped on her comfortable shoes, grabbed her things, and kissed Jonathan on the cheek before heading out the door. Maya arrived at the airport with plenty of time to spare. The terminal was busy as usual, people hurrying to catch their flights or standing in long lines, waiting for their turn at security. It was all so routine. Maya moved effortlessly through the crowd, her mind already focusing on the day ahead, the meetings, the presentations, the negotiations. She approached the check-in counter, where a young woman stood ready to assist her. The flight attendant behind the counter greeted her with a smile, but there was something off about it. Maya couldn't quite put her finger on it at first, but the woman's eyes seemed to linger just a little too long on her. Maya shook the feeling off as just nerves. After all, she was just another passenger. She showed her ticket, went through the motions of security, and found herself seated in first class, just as she always did. As the flight began to board, Maya settled into her seat by the window. She liked this part of the flight, the moment where everything was quiet, before the plane took off and the hustle and bustle of the cabin grew. Maya leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about her life, about the work that kept her so busy, and about the future. But her peace was short-lived. Just as she was beginning to relax, a voice cut through the calm. "Excuse me, ma'am," came the voice of a flight attendant. Maya opened her eyes to see a woman standing in the aisle, looking at her with a strange expression. The woman was tall, with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. Her uniform was crisp, and her eyes held a certain coldness that made Maya's stomach tighten. "Yes?" Maya asked politely, smiling. "I'm afraid you're in the wrong seat," the flight attendant said, her tone clipped. Maya frowned, momentarily confused. She glanced at her ticket again, then back at the attendant. "I'm sorry, but this is the seat assigned to me." The attendant didn't seem convinced. "No, ma'am. I believe you've made a mistake. This is a first-class seat, and your ticket shows a seat in economy." Maya's confusion deepened. She double-checked her ticket once more, her fingers tracing the details. "No, this is my seat," she said, her voice starting to edge with frustration. "I'm in first class." The flight attendant looked at her for a moment, then her lips curled into a thin, almost imperceptible smile. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to move," she said. Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. Maya blinked, taken aback. She had never experienced anything like this before. First class had always been the norm for her, and she had never been questioned in this way. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice quieter now, trying to keep the peace. The attendant nodded firmly. "Yes, ma'am. You'll need to move. There's someone else who's supposed to be sitting here. Maya stood up slowly, still unsure of what was happening. She had traveled first class many times before, and she knew this was her seat. Something about the way the attendant was acting made her feel uneasy, as if she were being dismissed, as if her presence was an inconvenience. Maya hesitated, not wanting to cause a scene but also unsure how to handle the situation. She had always been a calm, composed woman, but this felt different. Before Maya could say anything more, the flight attendant continued. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to move to another seat. There are plenty of available seats in economy. Maya looked around at the other passengers. Some were watching the exchange, others seemed oblivious. It wasn't that she was bothered by people staring, she had grown used to it over the years. But something about this felt different. This wasn't just a case of a misunderstanding. The flight attendant's tone was condescending, almost like Maya didn't belong in this space. Maya's mind raced. Should she argue? Should she make a scene? She thought of her husband, Jonathan, and the life they had built. She thought about the quiet, unassuming way he operated in the world. But she had never been someone to hide behind her husband's name. Still, it was hard to shake the feeling that this flight attendant was treating her differently for reasons that had nothing to do with her ticket. She took a deep breath and stood her ground. I'm not moving, she said firmly. This is my seat. The flight attendant narrowed her eyes. You will move, she said, the edge of her voice now unmistakable. Or I will have to call the captain. Maya's pulse quickened. This was getting out of hand, and she wasn't sure what to do next. She didn't want to cause trouble, but she also didn't want to be bullied. There was a moment of silence between them, the tension thick in the air. Other passengers were beginning to notice. Some whispered to one another, while others just stared. Maya wasn't sure if it was the sudden pressure of the situation or if it was just the flight attendant's attitude, but something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to be pushed around anymore. She knew she had a right to be in that seat, and she wasn't going to let anyone tell her otherwise. I'm not moving, Maya repeated, more forcefully this time. The flight attendant hesitated, clearly taken aback by Maya's calm defiance. But then her demeanor shifted. She stood up straighter, her expression hardening. Fine, she said through clenched teeth. But you'll regret this. Maya didn't respond. Instead, she turned to face the window, her heart racing. She wasn't sure if she had made the right choice, but there was no turning back now. The plane took off shortly after, and Maya tried to push the whole incident from her mind. She couldn't help but wonder, though, what had made the flight attendant treat her this way? What had she done to deserve such hostility? As the plane soared through the sky, Maya's thoughts were scattered, each one a little more anxious than the last. She had a sinking feeling that something was wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint what it was. It wasn't until later in the flight that the true nature of the situation would reveal itself. As the plane hummed steadily through the clouds, Maya's thoughts continued to race. The tension she'd felt earlier began to settle, but a strange unease lingered in the back of her mind. What had she done to provoke that flight attendant? The more she thought about it, the more the whole situation seemed bizarre. She had never been one to stir trouble, especially not in a public place like this. Maya glanced around at the other passengers, hoping to find some comfort in the familiar sight of people reading, talking, or nodding off to sleep. But her mind wouldn't let go of the nagging feeling that something was terribly off. Just then, the flight attendant who had confronted her earlier appeared again, but this time, she didn't approach Maya directly. Instead, she stood a few rows ahead, talking to another attendant, her voice low but sharp. Maya couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see the quick glances they exchanged. It was obvious that the flight attendant was still irritated, and from the way she was acting, Maya began to feel that the situation wasn't just about the seat. It was about something deeper, something more personal. Her suspicions were confirmed when the attendant finally made her way back toward Maya's row, but this time, she wasn't alone. The first attendant was followed by another flight crew member, a man who appeared to be a supervisor, his uniform slightly different from the others. He looked around, scanning the cabin with an air of authority. He locked eyes with Maya for a brief moment before turning back to the first attendant. Maya's heart began to race again. She had no idea what was going on, but she felt the oppressive weight of their attention on her, and it made her skin crawl. Her hands clenched at her sides as she tried to remain calm, but her instincts were screaming at her. Something wasn't right, and she needed to figure out what it was. The male attendant stopped in front of her seat. He didn't ask if everything was okay, didn't offer a polite greeting, just stared at her, his gaze heavy with judgment. "Ma'am," he began, his tone polite but with a hint of authority. "I'm afraid there's been a mix-up with your seating arrangements." Maya looked up at him, confused. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. This is my seat. I've already shown my ticket." She felt her voice tightening as the frustration built up again. The supervisor nodded slowly, but his expression didn't soften. "Yes, we've already verified your ticket. However, we've been informed that this seat was reserved for a different passenger." Maya felt her chest tighten. The words didn't make sense. Her ticket had clearly been for first class, and there was no reason for anyone to question her presence here. The flight attendant who had initially challenged her seemed to be standing off to the side now, watching the exchange with a cold, calculating look. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to move, ma'am," the supervisor continued, his voice firm. "We need to accommodate the proper passenger in this seat." This time, Maya stood up slowly, her mind racing. "Who's the proper passenger?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have a confirmed seat, and I've paid for this ticket." The supervisor hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the first flight attendant before responding. "The seat is reserved for someone of greater importance," he said, as if it were a justification. Maya's stomach sank at his words. She had never been treated this way before, and the way he said greater importance sent a chill through her. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about something else entirely. The insinuation hung in the air between them, making Maya feel small, insignificant. "No," Maya said, more firmly this time. "I won't move." She could feel her blood rushing in her ears, the adrenaline surging through her veins. This wasn't just about a seat, it was about respect. About dignity. She wasn't going to be intimidated. The supervisor's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Maya thought he might say something more, but instead, he turned away without another word. His abrupt exit left Maya standing in the aisle, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but she had no idea what it was. As he walked back to the front of the plane, the flight attendant who had first confronted her approached again, this time with a more forceful step. Maya didn't look away. She wasn't going to give in to this treatment, no matter what. "Ma'am, you don't understand," the flight attendant said, her voice low but tense. "You're causing a scene. You need to move before things get worse." Maya looked around at the other passengers. Some of them were still watching the exchange, some looked away quickly, not wanting to get involved. But there were a few who still seemed to be interested, their eyes flicking back and forth between her and the flight attendants. She could see the quiet judgment in their gazes. "You're making a mistake," Maya said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've done nothing wrong. This is my seat, and I'm staying here." The flight attendant's face darkened, and she leaned closer, lowering her voice so only Maya could hear. "You think you're special, don't you? Just because you've got money, you think you can get away with anything." Maya's jaw tightened. "I think I deserve to be treated with respect," she said, her voice a little louder now. "I'm not going anywhere." The attendant's lips curled into a thin, mocking smile. "We'll see about that," she said coldly, before turning and walking toward the cockpit. Maya stood there for a long moment, her body rigid with tension, her mind reeling. The words, "You think you're special," echoed in her head. It was clear now, this wasn't about a seat or a ticket. This was about something else entirely. But what? Why was she being singled out? And why was this woman, this flight attendant, so determined to push her around? The flight continued, but the unease in Maya's chest never left. Every minute that passed seemed to add weight to the strange, simmering tension that hung in the air. She couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen, but she had no way of knowing what it would be. Hours passed. The plane cruised smoothly through the sky, the rhythmic hum of the engines filling the cabin. Maya tried to focus on her thoughts, but it was impossible. The earlier confrontation with the flight attendants had left her too rattled, too uncertain of what was going on. She looked out the window, watching the clouds stretch beneath her, trying to find something, anything, that would ground her. But the uncertainty only deepened with every passing minute. She needed answers. At some point during the flight, the same supervisor approached her again, but this time, he wasn't alone. He had a second, more authoritative figure with him, a man wearing a well-tailored suit, his face stern and unreadable. As they reached Maya's seat, the supervisor hesitated, then nodded at the man in the suit. The man stepped forward, his eyes scanning Maya with an air of indifference, as though he were assessing her worthiness for something. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice smooth but authoritative. "I'd like to have a word with you." Maya's heart skipped a beat. Something was happening now. She had no idea what it was, but she was about to find out. Without waiting for her response, the man motioned for her to follow him, his expression unreadable. She hesitated for just a moment before standing up, her legs feeling like lead. Something told her that whatever was coming next would change everything. She followed the man, her mind racing, as the strange, unsettling feeling grew stronger with every step she took. What did he want? What was happening? As she walked toward the front of the plane, the tension between her and the flight crew seemed to intensify, and Maya felt as though she was heading straight into the unknown. Little did she know, this moment was about to spiral into something unimaginable. The truth behind the bizarre treatment she had received would soon be revealed, something no one could have predicted. Maya's steps echoed in the quiet cabin as she followed the man in the suit, her heart hammering in her chest. Each step felt like it carried her further away from the life she knew, into a world that was foreign, unsettling, and full of questions. The flight attendants had kept their distance, but their eyes never left her, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and cold judgment. The atmosphere had shifted from routine to something far more tense, as if she were a puzzle they were trying to figure out, and Maya was the missing piece. She could feel their eyes on her back, and she could sense that whatever was about to happen, it wasn't going to be simple. As they reached the front of the plane, the man in the suit motioned for her to follow him down a narrow aisle that led to a small, private area near the cockpit. Maya hesitated but followed, her mind racing. She had no idea what they wanted from her, but everything in her gut screamed that this was about to get worse before it got better. As she stepped into the small room, the man turned, his face still unreadable. He gestured for her to sit in one of the chairs near the corner, but Maya remained standing. Something about the situation made her feel trapped, like a rat in a maze. "Sit down, please," the man said, his voice smooth but with an undertone of authority that made her spine stiffen. "This won't take long." Maya's mind was racing, but she didn't respond. Her instincts told her not to show any sign of weakness, not to let them think she was scared, even if she was. She remained silent, standing her ground. The man studied her for a moment, his cold eyes assessing her, before he spoke again. "You're probably wondering why you've been singled out like this," he began, his voice calm but tinged with something that sounded almost like amusement. "We don't usually have passengers questioning our authority on board. Especially not ones like you. Maya felt her stomach churn at his words. The implication was clear, he didn't see her as someone who belonged here, someone who had the right to question anything. She clenched her fists at her sides, trying to keep her composure. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. I just want to know why I was treated this way. I paid for my seat, I have a ticket, and I'm following the rules. The man's lips twitched slightly, but his gaze remained as cold as ever. You're being treated this way because you've crossed a line, Maya. Maya froze. How did he know her name? She hadn't introduced herself to anyone on the plane, and she couldn't remember telling anyone who she was. The air around her suddenly felt heavier, as if the walls of the small room were closing in on her. What do you mean? She asked, trying to mask the fear creeping into her voice. The man's expression shifted ever so slightly, a flicker of something darker passing across his face. You see, Maya, you're not just any passenger. You're married to someone very important. Someone with a lot of influence in the airline industry. The words hit her like a slap to the face. She opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. How did he know about her husband? He couldn't, could he? It was all too much, too fast, and Maya felt like she was losing her grip on the situation. Your husband, the man continued, his voice almost too smooth, is the owner of this airline. Maya's mind went blank. The blood drained from her face as the truth sunk in. She had never told anyone about her marriage, especially not on a plane full of strangers. Her husband's business was well known, but she had always kept her private life separate from his. She had no idea how they had figured it out, but somehow, they had. And now, she was here, in this small, uncomfortable space, facing the consequences of something she didn't even know she had done. I don't know what you think you know, Maya said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and confusion, but I didn't do anything wrong. I'm just a regular passenger. I bought my ticket, I followed the rules, and I deserve to be treated with respect, just like anyone else. The man studied her for a long moment, his eyes calculating. The problem, Maya, is that you're not just anyone else. You're married to someone with power. And when someone like you is treated poorly, it can have consequences. People will talk. And that can affect the reputation of the airline, the crew, and everyone involved. Maya's mind was reeling, trying to process everything he was saying. Was he threatening her? Did they want her to stay silent, to ignore the way she had been treated? Maya couldn't understand why it mattered so much, why she was being singled out like this. She wasn't some celebrity, some high-profile passenger. She was just a woman who happened to be married to a man with money and influence. But the way they were looking at her made her feel like she had something to prove, like they were testing her, daring her to challenge their authority. She wasn't going to let them win, though. Not without a fight. I don't care who my husband is, Maya said, her voice growing stronger. I care about what's right. And what happened to me on this plane was wrong. No one should be treated like that, no matter who they are. You're not going to silence me, and you're not going to intimidate me into forgetting what happened. The man's face didn't change. If anything, his eyes hardened, but there was something almost impressed in the way he looked at her. You're very bold, Maya, he said, his voice laced with something like admiration. I'll give you that. But be careful. Your actions have consequences. You think this is just about a seat, but it's not. It's about power. And you don't understand the power you're dealing with. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. The man's words were starting to sink in. She was caught in a web, and the longer she stayed here, the more she felt it tightening around her. She had to get out of this room. She had to get back to her seat and figure out what to do next. But she knew, deep down, that this wasn't going to end here. The confrontation was just beginning, and what followed would change everything she thought she knew about herself, her marriage, and the life she'd been living. The man stood up abruptly, his eyes still locked on hers. "You can go now," he said, his voice cold once more. "But remember, Maya, you're not the one in control here. You never were." With that, he turned and walked out of the small room, leaving Maya alone with her thoughts. Her heart was still racing, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of everything that had just happened. She had never felt so exposed, so powerless. As she made her way back to her seat, the weight of the situation started to press on her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken an irreversible turn. The truth had been revealed, her identity, her connection to the airline's owner, and now, there was no going back. But what would happen next? Would she let this incident define her, or would she find a way to use it to her advantage? Only time would tell. The plane was almost silent as Maya returned to her seat, her mind a whirl of thoughts, questions, and an unshakable unease. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Gone were the casual glances and friendly exchanges between passengers. Now, there was an undercurrent of tension, an invisible wall between her and everyone else. As she sat back down, she felt a strange sensation of being watched. The eyes of the flight attendants, cold and distant, seemed to follow her every move, and Maya could feel the weight of their scrutiny like a physical presence. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to settle into her seat, but the world around her felt like it was slowly closing in. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer just a passenger on a flight, she was an object of fascination, a subject in a story that was still being written, and she had no idea where it was going. Minutes felt like hours as the flight continued, the hum of the engines and the occasional cough from a fellow passenger doing little to calm her nerves. She tried to focus on the book in her lap, but the words blurred together. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the confrontation in the small room near the cockpit. The man in the suit's words replayed in her mind, each one more chilling than the last. "You're not just anyone else. You're married to someone with power." It wasn't that Maya hadn't known her husband's influence. She had always been aware of his success in the business world, the way people treated him with respect, even awe, because of his wealth and status. But she had always kept herself separate from his empire. Maya had never cared for the spotlight, never sought out the attention that came with being married to a man of his stature. She was content with her life, her job, and the quiet moments she cherished with her husband when he wasn't traveling or caught up in the demands of his business. But now, that comfortable life felt like a distant memory. The moment the flight attendant had treated her like an outsider, everything had changed. And now, with the knowledge that she was married to the owner of the airline, she couldn't help but wonder how much her world had truly shifted. Maya's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a voice overhead. "We will be landing shortly, folks. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Her hands shook as she reached for the seatbelt, and she quickly strapped herself in, though she felt no comfort in the safety of the seat. The incident had unsettled her more than she cared to admit, and now, as they descended toward the airport, her mind raced with all the possibilities of what could happen once the plane landed. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this situation was far from over. It was just the beginning, a spark that had set off a chain reaction she couldn't control. As the plane touched down, the cabin erupted in a flurry of activity. Passengers unbuckled their seatbelts, gathered their things, and began to file toward the exit. Maya remained seated for a moment, watching the chaos unfold around her. She couldn't bring herself to move. There was too much on her mind, too much at stake. She knew that she couldn't just let this go. The humiliation, the way she had been treated, could not be swept under the rug. But what could she do about it? She wasn't in a position of power. She wasn't the one who could make demands. Or was she? Her thoughts were interrupted again, this time by a voice, a familiar one, but with a tone that made her stomach twist in discomfort. It was one of the flight attendants, the woman who had originally confronted her at the gate. She was standing in the aisle, her eyes locked on Maya with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "Maya," the flight attendant said, her voice low and measured, "I need to speak with you. It's about what happened earlier." Maya's pulse quickened. She had hoped that once the plane landed, everything would be over. But the fact that this woman was seeking her out now, so soon after the confrontation, made it clear that this wasn't going to end quietly. "I don't think there's anything more to discuss," Maya said, her voice steady but with an edge of finality. "What happened, happened. I don't need an apology." The flight attendant's lips tightened. "You don't understand," she said, her eyes darting toward the front of the plane, as if checking for someone. "There are things you don't know. Things that could change how you see all of this." Maya raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "What are you talking about?" The flight attendant hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to continue. Finally, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a whisper. "You don't realize the kind of attention your husband's company is under right now. You don't know what kind of enemies he's made. Or the length some people will go to in order to manipulate situations like this." Maya's blood ran cold. She wasn't sure whether the flight attendant was trying to warn her or intimidate her, but the implications of what she was saying were clear. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone had deliberately put her in the position she was in. The way the flight attendant had treated her, was it personal? Or was there something more behind it? "I think you're in over your head, Maya," the flight attendant continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just about a seat on a plane. This is about power, influence, and the price you'll pay if you stand in the way of the wrong people." Maya felt her chest tighten as the weight of the woman's words settled over her like a heavy blanket. Her hands clenched into fists in her lap, and for a moment, she was speechless. This was bigger than just her. Bigger than just the insults she had endured on the plane. There were forces at play here that she didn't understand, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was no accident. The flight attendant turned to leave, but before she walked away, she paused and looked back at Maya. "Be careful," she said, her voice low and full of warning. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Maya's mind was racing as the woman walked away, disappearing into the crowd of disembarking passengers. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as the truth of the situation started to settle in. Whoever had orchestrated this, whoever had made her a pawn in this twisted game, was still out there, watching her every move. Maya had always thought of herself as an ordinary woman, someone who had built a life away from the spotlight, who had always chosen peace over drama. But now, she was forced to confront the harsh reality: her marriage, her life, her very existence, were part of something much larger and much darker than she had ever imagined. And she had no choice but to navigate this new, dangerous world or risk losing everything. She walked off the plane, her mind heavy with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. One thing was clear: this wasn't just about what had happened on the plane anymore. This was the beginning of something much bigger, something that could change the course of her life forever. Maya stepped off the plane, her legs shaky as she walked through the terminal, the roar of the bustling airport around her now muffled by the deafening sound of her thoughts. Everything had changed, and she felt like she was standing on the edge of something that could shatter her world in an instant. The flight attendant's cryptic words echoed in her mind, each one like a shadow that grew darker with every passing step. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The words clung to her, a haunting reminder that there were forces far beyond her control that were now pulling at the strings of her life. As she reached the baggage claim area, Maya felt the weight of all that had happened settle upon her. She could hear the voices of passengers around her, chatting about their travels, their mundane stories of delays and missed connections. To them, this was just another flight, another trip. But for Maya, this had become something much bigger, something that could threaten everything she had known. She stood there for a moment, taking in the chaos, trying to steady her breath, when she felt a tap on her shoulder. Maya turned, her heart skipping a beat, but it was only a man in a dark suit, someone who looked out of place in the crowd. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, held a depth of knowledge, as if he knew more about her than she cared to admit. "Mrs. Owens," he said with a slight nod, his voice smooth but with an undercurrent of something else. "I'm glad I caught you before you left." Maya's stomach twisted, a cold chill running through her as she took a step back. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the surge of fear coursing through her veins. She had learned enough by now to recognize that this wasn't a coincidence, that the path she was walking on was fraught with danger. The man didn't answer her question directly. Instead, he gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I think you already know that the situation on the plane wasn't entirely accidental. Your husband's business has made some waves recently. And those waves have a way of spreading far beyond the boardroom." His words sent a chill down her spine. "You see, people like your husband tend to make enemies along the way. Powerful people. People who can make things happen. And now, they're interested in you." Maya's mind raced, her thoughts spiraling as she tried to make sense of what he was saying. Who were these people? What did they want with her? Why had they singled her out? She had always tried to stay out of the public eye, away from the corporate games that defined her husband's world. But now, it seemed, there was no escaping it. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's eyes gleamed, as if he were enjoying the game, enjoying watching her piece everything together. "Because, Mrs. Owens, there's still time to make things right. You're in a unique position to help put an end to this. All it takes is a simple choice." He paused for a moment, studying her reaction. "You can walk away, go home, pretend this never happened. Or you can choose to stand with us. Help us eliminate the threats before they become bigger problems. The decision is yours." Maya's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of anger, confusion, and fear twisting inside her. She had never wanted any part in the dark world her husband had been involved in. She had never asked for this, and now, she was being told that her only choices were to either walk away or become part of something she didn't understand. There was no safety, no simple return to the life she had once known. For a moment, she was silent, her thoughts a blur as she processed the man's words. But then, something inside her snapped. She wasn't just going to stand by and let her life be manipulated by shadowy figures who thought they could control everything. She wasn't going to let her family, her husband, be used as pawns in a game she didn't even understand. "I don't know who you think you are," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of defiance and resolve, "but I won't be part of your plan. I'll go to the authorities. I'll tell them everything." The man's smile faded, but he didn't look angry. Instead, he looked almost amused. "You can try," he said calmly, "but you'll find that the truth isn't always as clear as you think. People like you, people who think they can change things by going to the authorities, often end up learning the hard way that power doesn't work that way." Maya's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the gravity of his words, but she refused to let fear control her. "I'll take my chances." The man nodded slowly, his eyes still cold but with a hint of respect. "As you wish," he said, turning to walk away. But before he disappeared into the crowd, he added one final, chilling sentence. "But remember, Mrs. Owens, you're not as invisible as you think." Maya stood there, rooted to the spot as his words lingered in the air. She felt like she had just stepped into a nightmare, one where she had no idea who was on her side and who was out to destroy her. She had thought that confronting the flight attendant had been the end of it, but it was only the beginning. There was something much larger at play, something far more dangerous than she had imagined. Her hands trembled as she walked to her car, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. What did the man mean by invisible? Was she being watched? Were they tracking her every move? She didn't know, but she felt the weight of being a pawn in a game she didn't understand. When she got home, Maya locked the door behind her, her heart racing. She felt like she was suffocating, trapped in a world that no longer made sense. She had always thought she could rely on her husband's influence to protect her, but now, she wasn't sure if that would be enough. If anything, it seemed like his world was full of hidden dangers, things that no amount of money or power could shield her from. Maya sank onto the couch, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She needed answers. She needed to understand what was happening before it was too late. The man had made it clear that she was in danger, but who was behind this? And why her? The next morning, Maya tried to reach her husband, but his phone went straight to voicemail. He had been on a business trip, but he hadn't been responding to her messages all day. She tried again, frustration bubbling inside her as the minutes ticked by. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her gut. Maya knew that she couldn't sit back any longer. She had to find out who was behind this, who was threatening her family and why. She had to take control of the situation before it spiraled out of control, before she lost everything. Her world had changed overnight, and now, she had to find a way to survive it. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, and Maya was determined to put them together before it was too late. The days that followed felt like they belonged to someone else. Maya moved through life in a haze, her body on autopilot as her mind churned with thoughts of betrayal, danger, and uncertainty. She had never imagined that her world could be upended so quickly, yet here she was, teetering on the edge of a dark unknown. Every moment felt like it carried the weight of a choice she couldn't make. Her phone rang constantly, but she ignored every call that wasn't from her husband. She was becoming a stranger to herself, caught between two worlds, the one she knew, and the one she feared might swallow her whole. Her husband, David, had always been a man of control. A businessman at the top of his game, his influence stretched across industries and borders. She had admired him for his ambition, his charisma, the way he made things happen. But now, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was keeping things from her, things that might have explained the events on the plane, the ominous man in the terminal, and the strange turn of her life. She hadn't heard from him since that morning, and the silence was driving her mad. Maya sat in the kitchen, staring at the cold coffee in front of her, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug absently. It had been hours since she'd last tried to call him, and her patience was running thin. With each unanswered ring, a gnawing feeling spread in her chest. She couldn't wait for him to come back and explain everything. No, she had to take action. She had to find the answers herself. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as she made her decision. She wasn't going to sit idly by while her life, her family, and her future were being manipulated by forces she didn't even understand. The first step was obvious. She had to get into David's office. She had been in it 1,000 times before, but now, it felt like a foreign land. There was a locked drawer she had never paid attention to, a drawer that her husband had always kept locked. She didn't know why, but it had never crossed her mind to question it. Not until now. The sudden urge to pry into his life had consumed her. She had to understand what had changed, what she had missed. Her instincts were screaming at her to act. When she arrived at the office, she was met with the familiar sight of polished wood, sleek furniture, and walls lined with books. But the comfort of it all was lost on her now. The warmth of their home, the sanctuary they had built together, had been replaced by a cold, unshakable tension. She walked straight to the desk, pulling open the top drawer, only to find it empty. Her heart dropped, but she didn't give up. She moved to the next drawer, her hands trembling as she pulled it open. Papers, contracts, and invoices filled the space, but nothing that stood out. She wasn't looking for paperwork, not exactly. She was looking for the truth. And that truth had to be hidden somewhere in this room. It was when she opened the final drawer that she found it, an envelope. The paper was thick and heavy, the seal unbroken, marked with a symbol she didn't recognize. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at it. Everything in her wanted to ignore it, to close the drawer and walk away, but she couldn't. There was something about that envelope, the way it seemed to pulse with a dark promise, that drew her in. Maya slid it out, her fingers brushing against the paper as she tore it open. Inside was a letter. But not just any letter, it was a letter from someone high up, someone powerful, someone who knew things about David she had never imagined. As she read the letter, the words twisted inside her, each sentence like a knife in her side. It spoke of deals that involved her husband, deals that had nothing to do with his company, his investments, or his public persona. It mentioned connections to people she had never heard of, people who had a stake in more than just money. People who had a stake in control. There were names, dates, and plans that included her, her family, and her business. The letter detailed a web of corruption and conspiracy, a world of manipulation that she had been living in without even knowing it. The very thing that had brought her into this dangerous game, the flight attendant, the strange man, the threats, was only the tip of the iceberg. Maya's hands shook as she dropped the letter back into the drawer, her mind reeling from the weight of the truth she had uncovered. This wasn't just about a flight or a misunderstanding. This was about her husband's involvement in something far darker than she could have ever imagined. But why had David kept this from her? Why had he hidden it all away? Had he been protecting her, or had he been keeping her in the dark, all along? The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had been living in a lie. Everything she thought she knew about her life, about her husband, was shattered in that moment. The world she had built, the life she had fought for, was nothing more than a facade, and the man she had loved and trusted was part of something far more sinister than she had ever believed possible. Maya had to act. But she couldn't do it alone. She had to find allies, people who knew more than she did, people who could help her understand the full scope of what was happening. But who could she trust? She had no idea who was on her side anymore, and the uncertainty was suffocating. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind racing, she made a choice. She wasn't going to let her life be dictated by a secret world she didn't understand. She wasn't going to be a pawn in a game she hadn't even known existed. She would confront her husband, no matter the cost. She would demand answers, and she wouldn't stop until she got them. The next morning, as David walked through the door, Maya felt a surge of emotions, anger, fear, betrayal, and something else. Something deeper. As he turned to her, his usual calm demeanor gone, Maya didn't wait for him to speak. "You've been lying to me," she said, her voice steady, but full of accusation. "I know everything. About the deals, the people you've been working with. About the threats." David froze, his expression flickering for just a moment, before he masked it with the same cold, calculated face she had always seen. "Maya, No," she cut him off, stepping forward. "I don't want to hear it. I deserve to know what's been going on. All these years, I've been kept in the dark while you've been making deals with people who want to destroy us. You've dragged me into this mess, and I won't stand for it anymore." David's eyes darkened, and for the first time, she saw a hint of fear in his gaze. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and strained. "I did it to protect you. All of it, everything I've done, it's been for you." Maya shook her head, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "You've been protecting me from the wrong thing. You've been keeping me from the truth." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their fractured reality hanging between them like a thick fog. But Maya knew one thing for certain: she couldn't go back to the life she had once known. Too much had been exposed, too much had been broken. And now, it was up to her to rebuild, to fight for her future, and to decide which pieces of her past were worth salvaging. The path ahead was uncertain, but she was no longer afraid. She had seen the darkness, and she was determined to walk through it, no matter the cost. The truth, no matter how painful, would set her free. And no matter how difficult, she was ready to face it head-on.